Welcome back. This time moving on to the final chapter, chapter 12, which is speed and agility training. As you can imagine, there's a lot of crossover between this and what we've talked about previously, particularly with respect to strength training, because the ability to reach maximum speed, the ability to change direction is dependent upon muscle strength, but also upon rate of force development, so power generation. Is another way to think about that. So a lot of these concepts will have quite a bit of crossover to concepts that we've discussed previously. So pretty straightforward definition for speed. It is the ability to cover a distance quickly. So that could be running speed as pictured there, but that definition also fits things like cycling speed, rowing speed, swimming speed, etc. Now, having just said that, breaking these phases down, this is largely a discussion or fairly specific to development of running speed. So in terms of the phases that the authors break speed down into, the first is acceleration. So that's going from a dead stop, in this case, because we're talking about just maximal sprinting speed, so it's going from a stop to speeding up, right? And so again, that's dependent upon your muscular strength, because in order to develop running speed, you have to push off of the ground, as that athlete is doing. And then in doing so, you have to have sufficient strength to push yourself into a fairly long stride. And then you have to have sufficient strength on the flexor side to help turn that leg over, to help pull it into the flight phase or the non-weight bearing phase. And then again, make ground contact, push yourself into the next step. So it's dependent upon the strength of the hip extensors, knee extensors, and plantar flexors primarily, but then also the strength of the hip flexors, the knee flexors, and the dorsiflexors to help recover from that initial stride. It's also dependent upon rate of force development, which is what RFD stands for. And again, that is how quickly can you develop force. So another way of thinking about that is muscular power. The faster you can generate that force, the harder you can push off of the ground, the more quickly you can push off of the ground, the faster you're going to be able to run. Then once you're accelerating, the ability to reach maximum speed is dependent largely upon mechanics. So one of the things that separates faster runners from slower runners is the efficiency of their movement, that all the movement or most of the movement is sagittal plane movement, so they are just flexing and extending at the hips. There's not a lot of extraneous rotation. They are just flexing, extending at the knee, not a ton of extraneous rotation there, because you can get some rotation at the knee. And then same at the ankle. And then being able to maintain maximum speed is the last phase. So that is, in terms of qualities, that is speed endurance, and that's dependent upon your running economy, because again, if you have a bunch of extraneous motion, not only is it going to use more energy to run at that same speed, but you're also just less aerodynamic, and so obviously that's going to slow you down. It's dependent upon your substrate, so particularly if we're talking about sprinting ability, so the ability to gain all-out speed for 10 seconds or less is largely dependent upon the ATP phosphocreatine system. The more of those you have, the more ATP, and particularly the more phosphocreatine you're able to store in the muscle, the more fuel you have for really rapid regeneration of ATP, so you can maintain higher speeds for longer, or you can maintain higher power outputs for longer, is another way of thinking about that. And then also your buffering capacity, because as you get close to the end of that 100 meters or the end of that 10-second run, you're going to start to generate some lactate or lactic acid, and so being able to buffer that. Now, obviously, it's not a ton. Actually, the primary limiter in a sprint like that, so 100-meter dash or 10 seconds or less, the primary limiter is actually substrate depletion, so you're depleting the ATP phosphocreatine system. But buffering capacity does play a role there. So then the three phases of running speed, acceleration, so speeding up, being able to attain that maximum speed, again, dependent upon mechanics, and then being able to maintain that through the finish line. So factors that affect the development of speed, the first obviously is energy systems. So being able to supply ATP to fuel muscle contraction at a really high rate, to fuel power output or high power outputs. And so being able to meet those energy demands is dependent upon the enzymes that are involved in producing those substrates, for example, So the enzymes that are involved in breaking down phosphocreatine, the enzymes that are involved in glycolysis, the enzymes that are involved in breaking down ATP. So with specific sprint training, we get more of those enzymes, and this book alludes to them acting more quickly. I'm not sure I'm super familiar with that theory, but at the very least, you have more of the enzymes, and a higher concentration of the enzymes allows them to run through more glycolytic cycles simultaneously, allows for more rapid breakdown of phosphocreatine. So with training, you get more of the enzymes involved in anaerobic energy production. You're also going to increase the store of those substrates. So again, a higher volume of storage of ATP, of phosphocreatine, and of glycogen in trained muscle cells. And then the last one on there is that you're able to overcome the accumulation of fatigue-inducing metabolites. So things like hydrogen, things like lactic acid. You get better at buffering that lactic acid. And so that then helps you to maintain those higher power outputs for longer. Other things that affect the development of speed: muscle composition. So as discussed, your type 2 fibers, which are your fast twitch fibers, generate more force. They generate more force more quickly. And so if you are gifted or blessed with a higher proportion of type 2 fibers, you are more likely to be successful in sprinting or power type activities. So the athlete who has more type 2 fibers is probably going to be the more talented sprinter. Now there are other factors to consider, but that's a big one in terms of sprint performance. Other things, neural factors. So here's one of the other ones to consider. The ability to activate the appropriate muscles in the appropriate order at the appropriate time, right? And so that comes with learning. There's also the stretch reflex, the ability to sense a muscle length and then reflexively contract and then propel yourself into the next step. So here, for example, when we're pushing off, you're going to be in plantar flexion, and then you're going to get some dorsiflexion. And so that stretch in the calf musculature, being able to capitalize on that stretch and then allow that to help you produce more power to push off. Neural fatigue. So being able to sprint at maximal speed is dependent upon the ability to recruit all of those motor units and to recruit them continuously. And so over the course of 10 to 20 seconds of all-out efforts, I was going to say all-out power, but all-out efforts, the ability to sustain that is dependent upon the ability to recruit those motor units. And there is some evidence that the motor neurons are going to fatigue a little bit. Their rate coding or their rate of depolarization is going to slow down some. And so with that, you're going to get a reduction in running speed or a reduction in power output. And then the last one on there obviously crosses over with neural factors, but that is motor unit recruitment. So being able to recruit all of the relevant motor units, and synchronization, being able to recruit all of them at one time. That's going to result in higher power output. Other things that affect development of speed: technique. So being able to, and the big one here is that sagittal plane motion, the very last little bullet I have on there. Not having those extraneous movements, not having those shoulder rotations, hip rotations, knee rotations, etc. Obviously, it's going to require sufficient strength. So as you can see, Usain Bolt and the rest of the sprinters pushing off there, you got to be able to, powerfully extend the hips, knees, and ankles. One of the interesting things here is that, so you can see the third bullet there, that elite sprinters increase stride rate and stride length more quickly than non-elite sprinters. That's not especially surprising. But what was somewhat surprising to me in the way this chapter was laid out, or in the author's discussion, was that your non-elite sprinters achieve their maximal speed more quickly than your elite sprinters. So they point to research that shows that top-level sprinters reach their maximum speed between 50 and 60 meters versus your non-elite sprinters reach their top speed between 20 and 30 meters. And so I think the reason that that's advantageous, and I am by no means a running speed expert, but I think the reason that that might be advantageous to have a longer acceleration period is it's probably a little bit more economical. You hang on to those ATP phosphocreatine reserves a little bit longer, as opposed to with those non-elite sprinters, they're going to run through their ATP phosphocreatine stores faster, and then that depletion is going to cause them to slow down through the finish line. Whereas you get a smaller drop off with your elite sprinters as they cross the finish line. And of course, development of fatigue, that's going to slow you down. And again, in sprinting performance, fatigue is largely related to depletion of phosphocreatine, but also that neural factor of the motor neurons, the alpha motor neurons, not being able to depolarize quite as quickly for a long period of time. In terms of developing speed and speed endurance, so this is a handy little chart I threw on here. I won't talk about it too much, but gives you some idea for speed development that if you want to work on acceleration, you got pretty short distances, pretty high intensities. They don't talk about work-rest ratios here, but with your acceleration type training, you're going to have fairly long work-to-rest ratios, meaning that pretty short work periods and really long rest periods to allow the phosphocreatine system to recover. If we're going to do a little bit more speed endurance, we're going to run longer. So we have longer work intervals, and then actually slightly shorter rest intervals. But you can see these are still fairly intense here, between 5 and 30 meters or 60 to 100 meters. Those longer sprints, obviously you're starting to dip into the glycolytic system, which is going to be important to develop for a lot of your interval type athletes. So again, soccer players, basketball players, lacrosse, those types of athletes. In terms of agility training, so obviously being able to be really fast in a straight line is important, but most of our sports require us to be able to slow down, which is decelerate, to then accept our body weight and then change direction and then accelerate in the new direction. So that ability to decelerate, change direction, and accelerate is what is generally thought of as agility. And so the ability to do those things is as crucial in most of our team sports as all-out speed is. Because it's great that you can get from A to B, but can you react to an opponent's movement? And if you can't, well then all of that speed isn't going to be super helpful. This one's a similar type of depiction of the factors that affect agility to the ones I showed you last time that were factors that affect VO2 max, factors that affect endurance performance. So in terms of the factors that affect agility, two broad set of factors here. The first one is perception and decision making, so being able to anticipate what your opponent's going to do, or being able to anticipate where you need to go, where the hole is going to be if you're a football running back, those kinds of things. That requires things like being able to see, obviously. Anticipating, based on this pattern that I recognize, the hole is going to be between the guard and the tackle, and I can be pretty sure that the hole is going to be between the guard and the tackle because that's where it was supposed to be. So based on my tactical knowledge, I know I should run through this gap. Based on the pattern that I'm seeing, it looks like it's going to play out that way, and I can anticipate that based on tactical knowledge and pattern recognition, and because I can see it, and so then I'm going to cut toward that gap. In order to do that, though, of course, they have to be able to get there. So that's your change of direction speed. So that's dependent upon technique, sprinting speed, and muscle characteristics. Technique is dependent upon largely body position. So you can see leg action, arm action in there too. Those play into being able to control your body weight. But in terms of change of direction, one of the things is being able to keep your center of gravity over your base of support, keeping your center of gravity relatively close to your base of support, because the higher up you get, obviously when we change directions, you want to be fairly low. You're going to squat down a little bit. The higher up you stand, the more of a torque that creates, more of a turning force, right, of your center of mass relative to your base of support. And so that's going to require stronger muscle contractions to overcome that larger torque. So the lower you can get, the closer you can get to the base of support, or the closer you can get your center of gravity to your base of support, the easier it's going to be to change direction. It's going to require actually a little bit lower intensity muscle contraction to change direction. It's obviously dependent on sprinting speed, how fast can you move, and then sprinting speed is dependent upon things like muscle strength, rate of force development, which affects power, etc. So this one isn't like, I don't know. I really like the depictions of the limitations on endurance performance. I don't know that this one is quite as clear, but because there seems to be a lot of overlap between the different factors that are cited here. But I'm also a little bit less familiar with this one than I am with the limitations on endurance performance. All right, so in terms of program design, so with respect to the principles of speed and agility development, we want to focus on quality over quantity. We want good reps, not a ton of reps, right? So with our endurance athletes, we do want quality, right? But mostly with our endurance athletes, we're getting lots and lots of quantity, especially if we're thinking about somebody like a swimmer that does just huge volumes. If we're thinking about sprinting and agility, we go the other way. So really high quality, relatively low quantity for those athletes. And to that end, we have to focus on proper technique at all times, because if you get too high of a volume or too high of quantity, then that can result in breakdowns in technique, which can then result in ingraining bad movement patterns, which are really hard to unlearn or to teach them, unteach, I guess. And so then that's problematic. So we want to make sure that we focus on having good technique and that we have a volume and not intensity, but really that we have a volume that's conducive to maintaining proper technique. In terms of the types of things we work on, so like everything else we talked about, so you want to work on similar movement patterns and similar energetic demands to what you're going to see with the sport. And with respect to similar movement patterns, not only are you going to have them do things like perform agility drills like on the agility ladder or change of directions around cones or those kinds of things, but you can build on that and have them do unanticipated changes of direction. So they'll do some agility work through cones, for example, and then have the coach indicate right, left, back, forward, whatever you want them to do. So there's an unanticipated direction change that they have to make. That's a little bit more sport specific than just running through cones or just running through the agility ladder. And then the other thing, one other thing that you can do is to have them perform agility type drills with a ball. So if we're thinking about soccer or basketball athletes, have them do different cutting drills while dribbling, and the same kind of thing with like a hockey athlete, have them do it with the puck. So we'll have to do anticipated and unanticipated changes of direction while maintaining control of the puck. Because if they can't maintain control of the ball or the puck while changing direction, it's not very helpful. So as mentioned, we have to develop supporting characteristics to make them effective or to make them agile, I guess. And so the primary ones are muscular strength and then working on the rate of force development. But in thinking about strength development, that includes things or basic movements like squat, like lunges, Bulgarian squats, those types of things. But you also have to work on some muscles that or movements that are fairly easily overlooked. So you have to work on things like the hip abductors, the obliques, the hip rotators, because those are going to be pretty involved in change of direction. But rarely in the weight room do we do a lot of hip abduction work, or do we do a lot of like lateral pelvic stability or hip rotator work. So just something to think about in terms of the supporting musculature. Because we want high quality, we're going to have to give good feedback, which includes verbal feedback, demonstrations of how to do the drills, but also video. So it's helpful for them, to hear you telling them, okay, well, you did this, it needs to look like this, that's great. But if they can see that, I think that helps quite a bit, especially with your younger athletes, because they don't know where their body is in space quite as much. In order to maximize speed and agility, it takes a high level of motivation. Because again, these are really explosive and fast movements. They require pretty good motor unit recruitment. And so to that end, they have to be highly motivated to recruit all their motor units. So they have to be really motivated and really focused in order to move as fast as possible. And then if we're doing speed endurance stuff, or we're doing longer sprints with shorter intervals, generating some lactate, that's uncomfortable. And so you have to be pretty motivated in order to withstand the discomfort that's going to come with that. In terms of variables that we can manipulate to affect agility or speed development, One of them is density, which deals with things like work-rest ratios. So it's the volume of training in a particular time period. But again, probably the easiest way to conceptualize density as they're using it here is as it relates to work-rest ratios. Also, the duration or distance. So how long are they sprinting, either in terms of number of seconds or how many meters or yards are they covering? Because obviously that affects or determines the energetic pathway. Shorter sprints, ATP phosphocreatine. Longer sprints, ATP phosphocreatine plus the glycolytic system. And so you want to train the systems that you need for your sport. In terms of exercise order, so again, any type of power activities or unbalanced or agility type activities, we usually want those to occur while the athlete is fresh. We don't want to do, again, under most circumstances, we don't want to do a bunch of really fatiguing like weight training, conditioning kind of stuff and then have them do agility, unless that's a specific thing you're going for that you want them to work on being able to maintain concentration, maintain agility, in the third period, in the fourth quarter of a game, those kinds of things. But if you do that, if you do a bunch of pre-fatiguing stuff, just one of the things to be aware of is that the risk of injury goes up some, because if they're doing agility drills after they've done a bunch of weightlifting and conditioning, it's more likely they're going to roll their ankle, right? So there's some additional risk by doing that. And obviously their form's going to suffer a little bit. Intensity, one of the ways you can do intensity is to use best times. It's kind of like a 1 rep max, and then do percentages based on that. So if we have an athlete that runs a 100-meter dash in 11 seconds, we can have them work on doing hundreds. Let's say if we want a little bit lower intensity, we can have them try to hit somewhere between 12.3 and 12.8. And the other thing that that's useful for is it helps them work on pacing, because your better athletes, your more elite athletes, are going to have a better understanding of their intensity and how to pace themselves. With respect to rest intervals, so again, if we're looking for really explosive movements, we're going to have fairly long rest intervals, so 1 to 50, work to rest. So if you're working for 6 seconds, you're then going to be resting for 300 seconds, those kinds of things. Because, again, we're trying to restore the ATP phosphocreatine system, and then we're trying to maintain a high quality of movement. And so because of that, we want to make sure that they're fully recovered between work bouts. If we're working on more speed endurance, then we're going to shorten the work-rest ratio, so from 1 to 50 to 1 to 4, or between 1 to 4 and 1 to 24. And then if we're working on the aerobic system, between 1 to 0.3 or 1 to 1. Usually 1 to 1 is pretty easy to do. I don't know why they went 0.3 here. 0.5 is pretty easy to calculate, so oftentimes people will do that. So usually for the aerobic system, it's 1 to 0.5 or 1 to 1 work to rest. Another thing they have here in terms of calculating load is volume load, which is the intensity of the exercise times the distance per repetition. And the authors say that this is a good indicator of training stress. So how fast did you run and how long did you run, and how fast is relative to your maximal performance. So the way that's calculated is pictured here. So if the athlete runs 200 meters in 48 seconds, they covered 4.17 meters per second. And so then to calculate the volume load, all we're going to do is to multiply their meters per second speed times the distance, and then that gives us, I got 8.34, but they list 8.33. So that's the volume load there. And so that would be a way to account for overall training load, thinking back to those diagrams that have, the up and down of the load that show that variation throughout the macro cycle. This would be one of the ways that you can count, or that you can quantify that with respect to volume of sprint type training. And then in terms of periodization, so I just included 3 diagrams of different periodization models. So this first one is for an Olympic sprinter. And so really what we're looking at here is what they did, is what they did early on in the anatomical adaptation phase. So they're doing a lot of uphill sprints and technique work. In the maximum strength phase, they're working on acceleration. And then as we get closer into that pre-competitive phase, or pre-competitives here, into the specific preparatory phase. Then they're going to work on acceleration and maximum speed. With somebody like a soccer athlete, they're going to go from linear to linear deceleration to change of direction and agility. So basically kind of from short sprints to probably some longer sprints plus change of direction to more focused change of direction stuff. And then for a football player, you can see how they combine it with their strength training. So you've got on Monday strength training and then agility, and then on Tuesday strength training and speed endurance, Wednesday nothing, combination here. And then as you can see, as they get closer to the actual season, they're going to deload them in that pre-competitive phase, and they'll just have 2 sessions a week rather than 4. All right, so that's it. That's all of the material for the course. So good luck on test 3, and I look forward to reading everybody's second program or annual programs and then your program critiques.